early childhood development. Each week we talk about a different stage of children development and what children need. And now, here comes your host.
Hello, everybody, and welcome. My name is Taryn, and you are listening to The Parenting. We are back again this week on the road to the inner child with Marion Makepace. Welcome back, Marion.
Hi, good to be back here, Taryn.
I have been having so much fun with you recording these sessions. And just before we started recording, we were saying how we think we'll be done next week and we think we'll be done next week, but there's so much in this. And there's so much information to get out to parents. So it looks like we're going to be doing this for a little bit. And I'm actually quite excited about it.
Well, yeah, as I said to you earlier, Taryn, I'm always surprised when I start talking and realizing how much information I guess I've accumulated over the years and how much awareness I kind of take for granted now. But I have to remember, I've been researching this for over 30 years. So
Yeah.
I suppose it's to be expected that there'd be a lot more than I realized. While I have the opportunity, please, I also want to apologize for my Wi-Fi last week. Hopefully today will be better, but unfortunately they were laying new cables in our area and they broke our conduit in the process. And we haven't had Wi-Fi for the last little while and they still can't tell me when I'm going to have it back.
That's crazy.
Hopefully that won't be too terrible, but I don't think we should stop doing this because the Wi-Fi is not there. So
Yeah,
we'll
I
do
agree
our
with
best.
you.
And I hope everyone can just please be tolerant of the slight strangeness in the Wi-Fi on occasion. Thanks.
I think in a sense, it's kind of good that last week's audio happened as bad as it did, because what we're doing here is talking about how perfectionism is not it, right? And we're not always going to get it right perfectly. And so in a fault like that, we have the grace to be human because it's beyond our control. We did the best we could with what we had, right?
Touches on exactly the thing. I think parenting is partially really hard work because you're dealing with people, little people who are still having to learn and master so many things. And it's to be able to find the patience and tolerance to cope with the fact that they're going to be clumsy and inept and unskilled at many things. You kind of have, if you didn't have patience before you had children, you're going to have to develop it fast.
Very fast. So we've been doing this road to the inner child where we've been talking about how an inner child comes to be. And we spoke about the parent, adult, and child ego states. We've spoken about the nurturing role of a parent. And in the past 2 sessions, we've been focused on the role of the guiding parent.
Yeah.
Do you want to give us a quick summary on that?
Well, I think the big thing is for parents to understand that they're basically creating their child's factory settings. And the thing is, that's what every one of us defaults to for the rest of our lives. So yeah, how we set those factory settings is really important. And the guiding part of parenting is a big part. And because it's big and complex, there are many little things that can go wrong. Okay, so that's why we're doing this, to help parents to have more information of what to be aware of and what to avoid doing. So when we start with a guiding parent, a parent's job is to notice what the child is doing and respond either with an injunction, a no to the behavior, and then what else to do instead, because there's no point in giving you a no without telling you do this, because no without that information doesn't help the child at all. It isn't any guidance. So the point about calling them the guiding parent rather than the controlling parent is there needs to be some guidance. Okay. But then also remembering to praise when you're seeing behavior that you do want. Well, we do this automatically with babies, but somewhere after that we lose the plot. And we unfortunately often take positive behavior for granted. But a child that's neglected, like where the parent doesn't notice or doesn't respond appropriately, ends up becoming what we call the wild or unruly child. And that's something parents need to be aware of. So we first spoke about guidance, noticing and responding. And if the response is a no, what to do instead.
Right. So do you want to do a quick summary on ways that parents do respond or should respond that sets up like the problems for the child? Do you want to summarize what we spoke about?
Okay, neglect is the first one, but the second one is to give them an absence of an alternative. So there's no point in saying no if you don't tell them what to do instead. All right. And then I spoke about the yes, but. So yes, you did well, but you can do better, which basically creates a sense of inadequacy in the child, especially if that goalpost is constantly moving. So they never feel good enough, adequate, sufficient. And it makes a chronic stress for the child. And then we went to talk at length about the importance of understanding developmental stages so that we knew what was reasonable to expect of the child. And the fact that unrealistic expectations creates an enormous amount of misery for the child. And chronic anxiety. So you get adults who have been chronically anxious since childhood because they've never been praised, never felt that they'd actually hit the goalposts. And so they become anxious and people pleasers, which is very bad news.
You know, you saying, sorry, you just triggered something. You saying that so often children are not praised and kids grow up with chronic anxiety. I obviously grew up in South Africa. And when I came over to America for the first time in 2007, was it? 2007, to au pair, and I lived with a family. And he would tell their child, good job, which is, it's clearly an American thing, because in every home that I've been in with children, I've heard that now. When a child does something, there's an encouragement, there's a good job, there's a good job. And that was so weird for me because I didn't grow up like that. I never heard good job. Like, it was just so weird for me, but I loved it. I absolutely loved that children were being encouraged. That was one of the things that really stood out to me about parenting on this side of the world versus where I grew up.
Well, I'm not sure that that's unique to America. I think that that is what healthy households and healthy families do, is they do the equivalent of good job. It may be well done or nice, right, or whatever, right, or, you know, a pat on the back or a high five, or it doesn't matter what the affirmation is, but it matters that there is an affirmation, that there is a constant reward through acknowledgement for positive behavior.
Yeah.
Okay, because that's the guidance. If what you do gets no response, it's a form of neglect again, and it's an I don't care. So if they draw on the walls and they get no response, it's fine. But if they're doing something you want and they get no response, it's it doesn't matter. I mean, the point is it doesn't matter. And neglect, as I said, is a disaster. So if you want a child to keep on doing something, catch them doing something right and get excited about it. And that excited is good job, or well done, or excellent, or I noticed you did so-and-so. I really am proud of you. Whatever version is typical for your family for how you acknowledge positive, but definitely acknowledgement is necessary. But now we spoke also last time about inconsistent parenting, and that is also something very, very dangerous. You don't need to say well done all of the time, and you don't need to say well done for everything. You obviously aren't going to congratulate a child, as I said, when they're walking at the age of 12, unless they're recovering from a broken bone. But you are going to praise them, encourage them, acknowledge them if they've got themselves ready for school, done all their homework, their bag is packed, their lunch is ready, and they're dressed and ready to go to school on time. If you want more of that behavior, and it is something that's comparatively new, you need to praise, reward, encourage, respond with enthusiasm, okay?
So essentially, we should praise what is developmentally appropriate, because at 1 year old, it's developmentally appropriate to encourage a child to walk. Whereas at 7, it's developmentally appropriate to praise a job well done independently.
Correct.
Okay.
And as I said, when they're getting ready for high school, to get to the point of praising them for being completely organized and on top of things without being nagged. Again, cleaning up a room, it should be, first of all, done with the child to show them how to do it, not done for the child, but done with the child. And when the child puts things in the box or puts things away, a parent should be getting madly excited. What I spoke about was inconsistent or unpredictable stuff. Now, that's not only appraising some of the time. What I'm talking about is some days it's yes to that behavior and other days it's no. And then the child doesn't know what's correct. There's no consistency. I always used to say that with my dad, I could never tell. Some days I could have burnt the house down and he would have found it hilarious. And other days, the fact that I was breathing was too much for him. And I just never knew. And it made me constantly anxious, hypervigilant, in fact, so that I became constantly reactive to his response. But also, like many children confronted with this inconsistency thing, there is a disrespect for authority that develops because authority is unreliable, unpredictable, which can create terrible problems later on in life. So it's something to be very conscious of as parents. We really need to be aware that that is dangerous.
I used to call it a temperature check. I used to temperature check my dad every day he came, because my dad was very temperamental, so his moods would go like, he would flip quickly. And so I used to do a temperature check. I actually used to see his cues as well, like if he was biting his lip or if his fists were clenched. I knew that it was a heated temperature and I was to tread lightly and walk on eggshells. But if he came in and he was smiling and the lip wasn't being bitten, then I knew that I kind of had like wiggle room to kind of seek, a little bit of attention, a little bit. But it was always like you never know what you're going to get with his moods and how much access I could actually have to him.
Something very important. Managing our moods as parents is a really, really important thing, and staying consistent in our response to our children, regardless of what's going on for us, whilst it's really challenging, is also terribly important. But I also mentioned a couple of others. I just want to briefly recap. It's what I call the no, 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 yes pattern. So nag, 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 and you will get your own way. So, mommy, I want sweeties now in the supermarket queue. And it'll be no, and it'll be no, and it'll be no. And eventually it's, oh, shut up, just have them, be quiet. And so children are rewarded for nagging. They're rewarded for negative behavior. And they learn if you just nag often enough, long enough, you will get what you want. So you're rewarding something you do not want to repeat. And that's why it happens consistently from the child.
Does that also create a lack of respect from the child to adult, because they know that you're not going to stand to your word, right? So your word has no value.
Correct. And unfortunately, learning that as a child, as I said, has the potential to create an adult who doesn't understand other people's no. It's just push harder.
Right. So there's a disrespect for boundaries, and even probably a disrespect of like authority. Very
much so. And then there's obviously the playing the one parent off against the other game that children very quickly learn. And then essentially you're rewarding manipulation, you're rewarding playing the game, right? They create confusion, inconsistency, and mistrust and disrespect for authority figures. So today, I want to talk about some other aspects. And, you've made some disclaimers at the beginning of previous sessions. And I really think this is one of those where we need to kind of emphasize this double, because some of the stuff that I'm going to talk about today is pretty sensitive stuff. And in fact, what we're going to cover in the next couple of sessions is pretty sensitive stuff. However, we do need to speak about it if we're going to do this properly.
Right, because what stays covered can't be exposed. I mean, obviously, right? And putting bandages on wounds or not exposing wounds, there is no healing. And that's what we after here, is helping parents heal from their childhood and not pass on their childhood to their children.
Parent
And
does
not
it
just
wrong.
parents, right? Not just parents. I
Yeah.
want to say adults who work with children, adults who
Yeah.
are exposed to children. So even teachers, because I've seen it in the classroom that
Yeah.
teachers who were raised a certain way pass that on to children, and they are
Correct.
actually such an important figure in a child's life. So I'm not going to say parents, I'm going to say adults, even those who are reparenting themselves, like just adults.
I completely agree. And I think it's really important to recognize that this is the parent thing, but actually anyone who is an authority figure and a primary caregiver for a child up till about the age of, well, to the teens really,
Mhm.
has a powerful impact on creating those factory settings. The first 3 years, you lay down the basics. Age of 7 is where 80% of the factory settings are done. And
Right.
the period of that, children are in school. So teachers do have a powerful impact. Let's not negate that. But if the parents have laid down a set of behaviors already, guidance already, then when things are dissonant with what happens at school, the child will bring it to the parents. And it is something, and I've had this happen with clients, where they've realized that their value system and the value system where their child is being educated was not a match, and they've actually had to move their child. So this is something to be aware of again, where you don't want cognitive dissonance between the school and the parents. So making sure your child is being educated in an environment where the value system is similar to yours is quite important. It's also to make sure that your value system, which obviously you will have inherited to a certain degree from your parents, is also healthy, because there were some unhealthy patterns that have developed in our culture that I think we're going to end up talking about over the next couple of sessions. Sorry, I was going to say we still have to cover abuse in all its flavors: physical abuse, verbal abuse, emotional abuse, exposure to violence, chronic instability, traumatic circumstances, addiction, codependence, emotional incest, etc. So still a lot.
So before you tell us what we're jumping into today, I do want to just rehash and reiterate our disclaimers that I've been saying across the weeks, that what we are exposing and talking about is not to condemn our listeners. It's not to condemn our listeners' parents. It's not to condemn anybody, but just to bring awareness, to be gracious with yourself and even with your parents, because again, parents do the best that they can with the tools that they have, and they may not have had access to this kind of information, and so then treated you the only way they knew how, and then you trickle that down to your children. But that's what we're trying to stop. So it's just bringing an awareness, but not to condemn or criticize how you were raised or how you were raising your children. So please do bear that in mind as we talk about today's topic, which is pretty, well, it's the introduction to very heavy, but it's pretty heavy. So Marion, do you want to talk us through what we are looking at today?
Well, I think today we have to start with what abusive parenting is. And I would describe that as when the response of the parent is shaming, blaming, or extreme, like yelling or even physical harm. And I know that it sounds silly to say, I don't believe that anyone listening to this podcast would actively choose to be abusive as a parent, but there are
Right.
subtle forms that have snuck in that people may well not be aware of. Okay? And the point about abuse is that it creates a combination of rage and pain in that child, a kind of impotent frustration, because we are pretty much born with some degree of moral compass when it relates to ourselves. And we can feel when something is not right. We might not have words to express it, but it's felt. And the problem is, if you're subjected to that, the result is both low self-esteem and absolute disrespect for authority, and potentially antisocial behavior, which usually starts to express itself in teens and adults. So you get these teenagers who they have no respect for the system because the system has abused them. Remembering parents represent the system when you're a child. So essentially they've lost trust in authority. So, in the extreme case, of course, prisons are full of people who experience severe abuse as children.
Yeah.
But unfortunately, it exists in much milder versions in a lot more places.
So when you speak about abusive parenting, what exactly do you mean? Like, what is abuse? Because this term is pretty taboo and not spoken about or not called out. Like, people, it's either overused, like where a situation is not abusive, or it's not used where there are abusive situations. So how do we recognize abuse?
Well, as I said, extreme behavior of any kind, but bottom line, anything you're not allowed to do to an adult, you should never do to a child. That would
100%
be your
agree.
first guidance, because the child is not on par with the adult. They have no other resource to
Mhm.
protect themselves. Secondly, the question is always, for whose benefit is whatever happening being done? If it's not for the benefit of the child, it's not good parenting. Okay. Now, I do not believe that there is any way you can explain rationally how extreme reactions are good for the child. What you described the other session where the father was yelling at a small child for dropping her yogurt,
Mhm.
that was not done for the benefit of the child.
No.
Okay, so there's your bottom line question. Is this helpful? Is this guidance for the child? Is this behavior I want my child to copy? Is this behavior that is helping the child become a more successfully functional human in our culture? And if the answer is not yes, then you can pretty much assume it's not healthy behavior as a parent.
Yeah, it does. And I'm just going to bring up, I don't want to call it a silly example, but it's a silly example. I was walking in the mall the other day, and there was this little girl dressed super cute, right? Skinny jeans, cute boots. She had a headband on her head. Like, she looked cute. And I've got this in air quotes. The thing is, these skinny jeans, this child couldn't walk properly. These shoes were too heavy for her little feet. I don't know how tight that little headband was around her little head. She was a new walker, probably like just over a year old. Like, you could see she's still a little like toddling along, but struggling because these skinny jeans, because these heavy boots, and then you've got this thing like tight around your head. Like, is that for the benefit of the child? Like, so yes, so from the outside looking in, the child looks cute, but is that benefiting the child, that the movement is so restricted, these shoes are so heavy, they're still learning to carry their own body weight, and now you've added these heavy boots onto her feet? I was a little irritated watching that.
Look, we can get into all of the things that, playing dolls with your child. It's, yeah, for me, is the child functional and comfortable are the priorities. Looking pretty, kids don't care. The parents
Mhm.
care, but kids don't care, not for a good few years. Only when we're dealing with peer pressure does that become an issue. Before that, the kid doesn't care.
Mhm.
So you kind of have to ask yourself who's doing this and for whose benefit.
Right.
And it kind of sounds to me when it's a 1 year old that mummy's playing dolls. So, yeah, as long as the child is warmly dressed where it's appropriate, or dressed, should I say more accurately, dressed for the temperature and dressed for the environment, everything else after that is really not important. It matters a lot when the child is older, but at that age, it certainly doesn't matter for the child. In fact, being comfortable and functional is the priority. So, yeah, I would say that's a mild example of exactly the kind of thing that's not appropriate parenting. But anyway,
Right.
I don't want to sound like I'm sitting here being judgmental, because I have a great deal of sympathy for the challenge that parenting is. And I'm not here to
Absolutely.
criticize, I'm here to help.
Right. So you just said that's a mild form of negative parenting. So obviously there's degrees of abuse where there's mild forms and then there's overt, like just
Yeah.
no. So do you want to get into mild forms of abuse?
Unfortunately, yeah, we definitely have to touch on that. One of the most common mild forms of abuse is what I call the blame game.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm really sorry, this is one of my soapboxes, because for me, our culture seems to have gone mad in that direction, in my opinion. And we've gone into blaming almost like an epidemic. So here's where I think it starts. And this is my opinion, and I'll explain the logic, and then you can tell me what you think. So I hear parents saying things like, "You make me so angry when you keep doing that," right? That sounds totally normal, doesn't it? The problem is, I would describe that as abuse. And I know that might sound mad for a moment, but what the parent has done is make the child responsible for their emotions, the parent's emotions. And that is definitely unhealthy. And it's actually a form of toxic shaming, where the parent doesn't feel comfortable and makes the child responsible for those feelings. You see, somewhere we seem to have become, I don't know, we seem to have lost the plot that the only person who's in control of our emotions is us. Nobody can make you angry or make you sad or make you feel any particular way. It's a choice. If your life depended on it, you would not get angry or sad if you literally were going to die if you did. We have feelings, yes, and we as adults need to manage them. And if you go back to the nurturing episode that we did, naming feelings and teaching a child how to comfort themselves with those feelings is part of parenting. But to make somebody else responsible for how you're feeling is not healthy, and that is actually a form of abuse.
Absolutely. So if parents want to break these abusive cycles, what would a healthy response to their children look like?
Okay, this is really important, and this is something that I actually have to teach an awful lot of my clients. You have to own your feelings. They are yours. You are in control of them. Nobody else is in control of them. You are in control of them. But you can acknowledge that certain feelings in you arise in response to certain situations. So, okay, so if I teach the formula is when you do X, I feel like Y, and it makes me want to, or it makes me whatever. In future, I would want you to do. Okay, so you're telling the person what you don't like, how it makes you feel, or what your response is, and what you want instead. So let's talk specifics, and specifics in relation to children, because this applies to everybody always. Right. So when you pull the cat's tail, I feel worried, and it makes me think the cat might hurt you. In future, rather stroke the cat from his head to his tail, like this. So you can do the even simpler version depending on the age. So you can explain more depending. But for an older, so you would say, no, don't pull the kitty's tail. It's going to be sore. Come, let me show you. Stroke the kitty like that. That's the sort of baby version. With an older child, when you play on your phone instead of doing your homework, I feel frustrated and it makes me want to take your phone away permanently. In future, I expect you to complete your homework and get that out of the way before you play on your phone. This way, the parent takes accountability. I feel, not you make me feel, but I feel. But they have made it clear that they're not happy. And they've also made it clear what they want instead, what their expectations are. And it's that subtle difference. It seems so small, but it's so big because the child is not responsible for the parent's behavior, but there is a cause-effect connection. In other words, when this happens, I feel like that, and it makes me react in this way, which will have consequences for you. Then people start to become conscious that their behavior will elicit a response in somebody else, but not that they're responsible, but that is the likely outcome. It's called consequence. So they don't have the capacity to control their parents' emotions, but they do have a probability of eliciting a response that isn't necessarily what they would want. And so what that does is teach them awareness of other people's responses rather than responsibility for those responses.
So this models then, yeah, it does. It models accountability, right? Because you as a parent are modeling accountability. So you're addressing that the child behaved a certain way. You take that behavior, not who the child is, which is a question that I have for you later, but basically addressing a child's behavior versus you make me angry is addressing child's character. But when you say, when you did this, right, it's the behavior, this is how I felt.
Correct.
There's a modeling of accountability and also taking responsibility. Would you say that it teaches children how to be accountable for their actions as well as their emotions? Because
absolutely. And the opposite, when you say you make me unhappy, the parent is talking from a victim space.
Yeah.
That's victim thinking, believe it or not. It's our version of victim thinking. And I think our culture has become rife with victim thinking. You have to change so I can be happy. Only what happens if three people have 180-degree opposite versions of how to be happy? Who do you change to which version? It becomes an impossible minefield. So owning your reaction is important, but at the same time, letting your child know that that is a consequence. So their behavior may make other people, including the parent, unhappy, and that there will be a consequence, right? And then giving them guidance as to what kind of behavior would be less likely to react to cause a negative response. That is useful. So to become aware that you can't make somebody else responsible for how you feel. And you don't want to create or model victim thinking for your child.
There's so much to it here. But this is such a great exercise for parents because it makes them more aware and accountable of their behavior when they know that somebody's watching and they're not just flying, off the handles.
Mhm.
So would you agree that it's a good exercise for parents to become more controlled in their responses versus a impulsive reaction?
Absolutely. Emotional regulation. You can't expect a child to emotionally regulate if you as a parent can't. I mean,
Right.
how can you, here we back to the do what I tell you and not what I do. Okay, so absolutely crucial. And so parenting is, it's an incredibly challenging job. And it's going to show you all your areas of weakness, whether you like it or not. A responsible parent, if it's bringing stuff up for them, will then go and work on it to resolve those issues so that they themselves are a happier, calmer, more together person, and also obviously a better parent. So, and these are learned patterns, they're generational. So again, if this is something that has been in the habit of happening in your family, it's going to be hard, and it's going to involve work on your part as a parent to change that pattern of you make me, as opposed to I feel this when you do that.
Right.
But I think, when parents recognize this overall, the kind of parents who I believe would be listening to this are ones who are wanting to do the best they can for their children. And I'm sure that with the right information, which hopefully we're able to give them, they can take care of this themselves. So I don't want to spend all, too long on this, because there's unfortunately a lot I want to still get through today, because blaming usually goes along with shaming and negative labeling. And again, negative labeling is epidemic, but it's also it's subtle, but it's powerful, and again, it's another form of abuse. So, right. So let's talk about where things can go wrong. Right. When you label, and you've just touched on it now.
Yeah.
We teach labels as parents. That's part of our guiding parent job. We teach labels. We teach that this thing is a nose and those are ears, and that thing over there is a cat, and this one's a dog, and this one's a horse, and so forth. We're teaching labels all the time, right? But we also teach labels around behavior, that is running and that is jumping, and that is, so we label it. And over time, we teach behavior that is acceptable and behavior that is not, right? So in one culture, we eat with forks and knives, in another culture we eat with chopsticks, and so forth. And in some cultures we eat with our hands. We teach it culture specific, right? And we label it as good or bad, wrong or right. So as parents, we need to be very clear what exactly we're labeling so that we don't confuse our child. So for example, and again, I think we talked about this previously in another session in a slightly different context, but if a child is jumping on the couch, if a parent says, stop that, that's bad, the child doesn't know what is bad. And they may arrive at the idea that jumping is bad rather than that jumping on the couch is bad. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. This is what I teach this in my coaching course, that you need to ask the child for what you want. That's what I teach my parents. And so instead of telling a child stop jumping, because jumping is not wrong. It's actually a way a child regulates themselves. Like a child's body naturally knows how to expel energy that's not supposed to be there. And so jumping is one of these ways, right? So instead of saying stop jumping, you tell them rather where they can jump. You can jump on the floor, you can jump on the grass, you can jump wherever. Give them tell them what you want, where you want them to do it, instead of stopping a behavior without giving them an alternative.
Okay, so it's not just the alternative, it's what you label. Here I'm talking about the labeling.
Okay.
So it's important to be clear what you are labeling as bad or wrong or not okay, because the child doesn't know the distinction between jumping in general, which is what they're doing at this moment, jumping on the couch. So it's important rather to say no, jump on the floor or jump on the couch or the grass, not on the couch. So now they know jumping is okay, on the couch is not.
Right.
So jumping on the couch is bad. So that's your ideal response for a 2-year-old or a 3-year-old. When they're a bit older, they're going to need a reason as well. So no, jump on the floor or the grass, not the couch, right? I'm concerned that you could get hurt or the couch could break. So there's a reason. And even when you say it to the 2 or 3-year-old and you don't bother with the explanation to the child, you need to have that explanation in your head, because there has to be a logical reason for why you are telling them.
Right. And that avoids the because I said so, which is not an acceptable response.
No. So it's age dependent as to how much information you give them. So you start with no, right? And then you go no because. But when you say no, this is the boundary. This is what's not okay. This is what I'm saying no to, right? So not no to biting, because you're going to bite your food. You want to bite the carrot, but you don't bite somebody's finger or somebody's face, all right? So biting as such is not bad. And it's to clarify, there's nothing wrong with biting, but you don't bite like this, or you don't bite there. You don't jump on the furniture. You jump on the grass, or you jump on the ground. So it's to be clear what you are labeling. And then there's the shaming. Now, you spoke, as I said, about that little girl in the yogurt episode, which I'm afraid is still living in my mind. I feel for that child too.
Same.
And it has to do with unrealistic expectations. He was shaming her by his reaction. Now, what do you mean by shaming? Well, intensive criticism, and with a message that says, you're not good enough, you're not up to standard, it's not okay, you're not okay. Such reactions are often combined with negative labeling, where the behavior or even the child is labeled as wrong or bad, which leaves the child feeling incapable and bad about themselves. When you shame a child, you're telling them they're not up to standard. And the big thing that worries me is the confusion between what the child does and who the child is. So instead of saying the behavior is bad, people tend to say you're a naughty child rather than it's naughty to jump on the couch. Okay? When you label the person rather than the behavior, you're confusing identity with activity. So if the child is doing something naughty when it pulls the cat's tail again, but that doesn't make the child naughty. And so when you confuse the activity with the individual, with the person, right, you're confusing it with their identity. Now, what's very important to remember is that children have no objective perspective of themselves, especially young children. Parents are the mirror, and later on the teacher. And the child takes whatever reflection they see from that person. So if you label their identity, they will take it as gospel. They don't question those labels. They did this as a test some years back in a school in America. And it was really, really interesting what resulted. They told a class, a bunch of teachers, the children in this class were this high, super high IQ, super low IQ, or average. They did it on a completely random basis. There was no legitimate reason for it. And then they watched the marks for those children for that year.
Mm-hmm.
And the children's marks at the end of the year directly reflected what the teacher had been told the child's intelligence level was not based on any fact. It was based on the teacher's perception of children. The teachers had labeled the child in their mind and labeled the child with their actions. In other words, how they treated the child, which in turn resulted in the children responding according to expectations. So when you label the child will live up to your expectation, particularly if you tell them so, that you are, So I just want it to be really clearly understood. Do not label the child. We do label them. If you're going to label a child, please label them positively.
Right.
Right? So in other words, you're so clever. That's already labeling the identity. Not that was clever, but you are clever. The child will believe they're clever.
Right.
If you label the child as pretty, it will believe it's pretty. If you label the child as naughty, in fact, Taryn, I want to one day, we come back on your thing and do a thing on the fairy godmother, wicked witch concept for children, because actually it's all about labeling.
Mm.
But we'll save that for another day. But the point is that when you label, be very, very sure that you have got a label for the behavior rather than the person, unless it's positive. Please.
So that's what I was saying earlier, right? Where we address a child's behavior versus addressing their character and who they are. Like, I mean, we can go into example after example, but when you are saying you are a liar versus you lied to me, there's a very big difference. One is labeling a child and one is talking about what a child did, their behavior.
Yeah. So I think understanding labels is such a powerful thing. And not shaming a child by labeling them negatively. Not shaming a child by telling them they're stupid because they can't, or they're wicked because they have. So that father, for example, with that little girl in the yogurt, he was negatively labeling her, he was shaming her. In fact, he's a good example of a whole range of abuse, because he then did something physically that was bordering on the edge of violence.
Right.
And terrified the child, I'm sure. And then what the child then watched was the parents having a go at each other. So, I mean, that was a whole toxic scenario that you described.
Absolutely.
Where the mother was defending the child and the father was attacking the child. I mean, that's actually horrendous for a child to experience. You know, I always feel really sad when kids are put in these situations. And ironically, they're mild. They seem to be mild because it's not a big deal. But actually, it is a big deal because remember, these things have massive impact. We've got small children where every day is like a year in our lives. The impact is so enormous. I mean, people always talk about how time gets faster as you get older. Well, yes, it does, because it's a function of how long you've lived. So, you know, one day in a 3-year-old's life is 1,000th of their life. One day in a 30-year-old's life is, I can't even figure out the number, but it's enormous. It's negligible as a percentage. It's important to remember that the events that we experience as small children have an enormous impact on our consciousness, and they tend to stay there. Being conscious that those labels that you're attaching to a child and that behavior that you're demanding of a child, the labels need to be attached to the behavior, especially if they're negative. Well, I mean, if your expectations are not realistic, if you're not understanding what the child is capable of. I mean, for example, toddlers only just started using their opposable thumb. They're not good at holding things. You can't expect a 2-year-old, for example, to use a pair of scissors successfully. I mean, you know, even when they come to kindergarten, they can barely color in the lines. I mean, they're using big chunky pencils. They don't have the fine motor control to be able to do these things. So it's a lot to ask of them. It's the same thing. We have to understand children have limits and not to shame them for what they're busy with.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, I know there are many other ways that children can be abused, because today the chat was all about milder forms of abuse. So can we get into the more overt ways in next week's chat?
Sadly, yes, of course we can. And, things like judgmentalism, perfectionism, all or nothing thinking, control rather than guidance are, well, it sounds silly, but there's lots of those things that kind of sneak in, like the blame game. You don't realize it until you stop and think about it. Subtle
Right.
difference, but a very powerful one. And it's the same thing with that sort of stuff as well. So yes, next week we'll come back for some more. And as I said, I think we're looking at a few more sessions to cover everything.
I'm happy to do that. Like, the more information we get out there, the better, I believe, for parents to realize that there's so much to it. And again, I say, for every big thing we do in life, there's a preparation. Like, if you're learning to drive a car, there's preparation. You've got to go for testing. You've got, like, there has to be a process. But when it comes to parenting, it's just like anybody can be a parent, but nobody does the work to learn how to do this thing. And that's probably the most important job, because you're raising a human.
Indeed. Ultimately, this will help parents also to understand some of the stuff that might be happening for them unconsciously. So I hope that it will be useful not only for them as parents, but for them as people too, to know some of the dynamics that may have gone on in their home that haven't always made sense until now. I hope that's useful in that way as well.
Okay, so we agree that we're going to park it here this week. And before we go, do you want to remind listeners how they can reach you?
Yeah, makepeacecoaching.com is the website. And Makepeace Integrated Wellbeing Coaching is my Facebook page, and you can find me on LinkedIn. And Taryn will have my phone number, and you can always reach me on my email address.
Thank you so much for joining us again this week, and we will chat to you again next week, Marion.
Thank you so much. Thanks,
Okay.
Taryn.
Bye.
Thank you for tuning into the parenting. We hope you enjoyed today's episode. If you have any questions, feedback, or content suggestions, please email us at Taryn@theparenting.com. Please remember to subscribe, like, share, and give my aunt a 5-star rating. Come back again next week. Bye!